The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas that varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans who have been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity have overcome. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Joan Maynard from the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant, an outstanding organization that has done so many things to keep our history alive. Joan Maynard, it's really a pleasure to have you here today.
It's my delight to be here, Dr. Brown.
Now, we were talking earlier, you said you've been at this for 33 years. How did you get involved in preserving Weeksville? And then a little bit later, you tell us about Weeksville and why Weeksville is so important.
Well, I guess since I was a child, I was always thinking about who I was. Had two marvelous parents. My mother was born in Grenada in the West Indies. My father was born in Brooklyn, from people who had come from the South, from Georgia and South Carolina right after the Civil War. And I found out early on that what it was to be a non-white person in the city of New York.
Well, tell us a little about that. You were born, I guess, back in the 30s or whatever.
1928.
And what was Brooklyn like then?
Well, I was a little kid, so I only, from a baby's standpoint, I could tell you. I was happy because I had wonderful parents and a good family. But I can remember being like about 7 years old and walking down Broadway with my father, who was a ventriloquist. He was in show business.
Oh, really?
And walking into the Brill Building, if you know where that is, on Broadway, and going someplace with him. And we went into a restaurant, and I said, "Daddy, can we go in there?" So there must have been something. It was told me that you couldn't go in every place, because there were places in Brooklyn at that time where you couldn't go downtown Brooklyn to eat. And that must have been in the 30s, early 30s.
Now, Weeksville goes back almost 100 years.
Oh, yes.
Now,
yes.
Tell us about Weeksville and why it's so important that we keep this memory alive.
Well, the name Weeksville, we understand, it derives from one James Weeks, an African-American who had come from Virginia to Brooklyn and managed to purchase a piece of land in the area known as Weeksville in 1838. And at that time, Virginia was a slave state. This is before the Civil War.
Before the Civil War.
And Brooklyn, New York, had only been a free state for 11 years because you actually had the abolition of slavery in New York State in 1827. So, I mean, this wasn't such a big jump. And even though it was officially a free state, there were many obstacles in full freedom at that time.
Well, there were some blacks who were free even during the Revolutionary days.
Yes, yes.
But when you say free state, that meant that slavery was prohibited.
Yes.
And as you know, when the Constitution was passed, slavery was allowed to continue to 1827.
So people, that three-fifths of a slave, rather, thing was really...
Three-fifths of a man. Blacks were counted that way.
Three-fifths for the benefit of the slaveholders of the South. So that the degrees of how people could exercise what was called freedom was very varied.
So it's unusual this man, James Weeks, would come to Brooklyn, buy land, and build a house. And I gather from that house, others came and he built a community.
Yes, he did. And of course, he had to work hard. And from what we know from the records, he couldn't read or write, which was one of the things, the terrible things about slavery, was it was illegal to teach a person of African descent to read or write. In fact, people, white people included, were punished or even lost land for doing that. And of course, worse things happened to black people for that.
What was his occupation?
He was a stevedore. People may not know that name. They might know the name Longshoreman. People don't even know what that is anymore. But he worked for something called the Black Ball Line for what is now the South Street Seaport. You think of it as a place to go and eat and buy nice clothes. But this was a working seaport, and to be a stevedore meant that no electricity. You put stuff in these holes of ship and you took it out. No electricity, nothing to help you crank it up or crank it down. No laws in case you got hurt. So if a load of stuff fell on your head, that was the end of you. There was nothing for your widow or your children.
But he made good money. He
made money, and he saved his money. He bought a piece of land. And the piece of land that he bought in the area known as Weeksville actually at one point belonged to the Lefferts family, which is a very large, old colonial family.
Yeah, Lefferts Boulevard.
Many, many things.
So then after he developed his property, He attracted other people to the neighborhood?
Yes, that's what it appears to be. We have done quite a lot of investigation, but even more has to be done because a lot of material people have thrown away, not realizing that these were the parts of the puzzle that we needed. But this man, I think of him as a pioneer, because a pioneer, according to the dictionary, is one who comes first with an idea and opens up a way for others to come.
So as the community began to grow, how large was the community in its heyday, which I guess was around the 1860s or 70s?
Well, I do know that the New York Age had, because New York Age was a very prominent African
That was Thomas Fortune's newspaper.
Yes, newspaper. And newspapers, and it's about reading and it's about knowing what's going on, are still the top priority. But I think right off the bat, 1911, an article which spoke about Weeksville and talked about 40 families it named, and many of those families are surnames that you can recognize. And then again in the Age, New York Age, in 1935, which at that time the Ethiopian War was going on. And there was an article in there that spoke about Weeksville, the Weeksville Church, the Bethel Tabernacle AME Church was celebrating its 94th birthday. So, and then it named a number, and in that article it spoke about James Weeks, about this man from Virginia.
Now, to get our audience tuned in on the geography of this,
yes.
Exactly where is Weeksville located? Well,
if you have an idea about Brooklyn, I'll give you some major points. If you can imagine the Kingsborough Housing Project, if you can imagine St. Mary's Hospital, which is part of the Catholic Archdiocese system, it's right there, just between St. Mary's Hospital and the Kingsborough Housing.
And the street names are?
And the street names, the number of the houses, the historic houses, are 1698 to 1704 Bergen Street, and that's on Bergen Street between Buffalo and Rochester Avenue.
Now, at one time, was that an actual street or was it a path?
Well, the original thing directly was a path. It was a pathway which was before there were any European settlers. It was actually an Indian roadway which went from the southeast corner of Brooklyn there, from Canarsie Bay, and I guess this started, and went right up to Williamsburg. So this was a major trail that the Native American people used.
Now, was there much industry along that trail, or was it just residential?
It was
building?
farmland. It actually was farmland. Yeah, because actually, Brooklyn actually is the western end of Long Island. Many people don't think
the historic Battle of Long Island in the Revolutionary War was fought in Brooklyn,
in Prospect Park,
and the
other places.
Yankee troops, revolutionary troops, escaped across the East River from right at the end of where the bridge is.
That's right.
Over to what's Kips Bay.
Yeah, and they went into Hoboken also.
So now you've given us some context about Weeksville. I know many of us have heard this before, but it's an exciting story every time you hear it. Now, what caused Joan Maynard to decide to discover these houses, develop these houses, conduct this educational campaign?
Well, I didn't discover them, but it was a really
Who did discover them?
Well, the first person who did research was Jim Hurley, who was doing research to do walking tours for the Museum of the City of New York. And he came across some materials in which was then the Long Island Historical Society, which today is the Brooklyn Historical Society. And it spoke about this community of African Americans having an old folks home, a school, several churches, and it had a branch of the African Civilization Society, which was an organization that was especially established to help the freedmen start to be able to read. We have a copy, a very precious copy of the issue of that newspaper, the Freedmen's Torchlight. And actually the front of it is actually a what can I say, curriculum for people to learn to read. Not young people, but adults too. Because that was what people wanted to do, to be able to read and write.
So now you found this community exists. What motivated Joan Maynard, the artist, to get into this?
Well, how I got into it, I didn't know about it, but I was doing other stuff in New York, and I managed to get to go to West Africa in 1965, and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was still alive, and I was just so delighted just to be there. I wanted to see where it all started. And I did go there, and that was fall of 1965. And I wanted to go back and do anything, because Dr. Du Bois was still alive at that point, and he was doing something, completing a work called Encyclopedia Africana. And I said I didn't care, and because I had an commercial art background, I wanted to go and work there. And that was fall of 65, and the coup d'etat took place in February of 1966. And then when the Nkrumah government was overthrown, the project, of course, couldn't go forward at that time. I think it was Dr. Alpheus Hunton was in charge. By this time, Dr. Du Bois had passed away, and then subsequently, Dr. Hunton died in East Africa. And then I was back in the United States, and one day a friend of mine, Dolores McCullough, said to me, there was a little bunch of people, and they had found this material about this place called Weeksville, and wouldn't I like to come to this meeting? And I went to the meeting, and that was it. And I consciously said to myself, when I had been involved several years, that I was going to do this for 10 years of my life. And it's been many, many more years than 10 years, and I'm still here, and I'm very delighted to be a part of it.
You went through it in steps. First of all, you had to, I believe, acquire the property.
That part was true.
And now, because the city owned it at that time?
Well, parts of it, it was in private hands. It was, I guess you would say, heirs' property. Actually the four houses that we were subsequently found out to be very important to this unfolding of the story of Weeksville were in private hands. The Williams family, and the place that was what we use as our headquarters. The people that are so generous, Miss Williams and all her sisters, they allowed us to use their address on our stationery and our cards, and let us use their phone number on our cards. We didn't have anything, but they understood what we were.
The significance of what was going on.
Yes.
So then you began to raise money to restore the houses.
Yes. First to buy it, because you can't restore anything unless you own it. And we were very fortunate. We went to the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, and at that time, Mr. Franklin Thomas was still there, and he bought the property for us, 3 of the 4 houses, and held them in trust for 3 years until we could buy these houses. And it was a very fortuitous thing. I met Jimmy Biddle, who was president of the National Trust, who introduced me to Mrs. Astor, and we got money to purchase the 3 houses. That's the money we used to repay Bed-Stuy Restoration. But Restoration never charged a nickel interest. You know.
Well, this is interesting. This is really a story that almost every black community and every black family can go through. How do you recreate the struggles and the history and the glory that we experience in our community? And you and your colleagues deserve a tremendous amount of credit for this. And you've gone from having restored the houses to making them educational institutions.
Yeah, we're very happy. A whole lot of people come to see what we have, and we also send...
what do you have?
Well, we have these 4 historic houses. The last house we bought from the Williams family, that was that wonderful family. But we have used it all these many years as a learning center to learn the history of Weeksville and the central Brooklyn African American community. But also understand we are not in a vacuum. We came from someplace. And Brooklyn has a distinction of being the most varied community of African Americans in this entire country.
Probably the largest, too.
It is. It's large, but varied. When I say varied, if you go to Lagos, Nigeria, you go to Bahia in Brazil, people are speaking, they're speaking English, they're speaking many African languages. You go to Bahia, these people speak Portuguese, you know. But in Brooklyn, people are speaking every known language, and some that we have not heard, things that I didn't even know about. I mean, because every place has a nuance of history that is brought forward in the language. And this is all found in, if there's certain streets you can go down in Brooklyn, you better be able to speak a bit of patois, otherwise you're in big trouble. Yeah, and you know, so we are speaking Portuguese, and we're speaking patois, and we're speaking many brands of English, and we're speaking African languages. I can take you to places that you can get fantastic African food in Brooklyn.
Oh,
you
yeah,
know.
that we know.
You know, but we are such an interesting and varied bunch of people. So we have a platform to display the African diaspora.
But what are some of the artifacts and pictures that you display?
Well, we have, among the things that we have there, we were fortunate to have some slave shackles, which will tell you something about, because the idea of slavery is multifaceted too. But when you understand what people did, even in those days, and still have to do, in spite of what impediments there are, you understand we are not a weak people. And I think if this can be gotten over, and that's what my feeling is, to tell our children, we are a strong people. We have come through a very hard time. We have had troubles. We will still have trouble, because everybody, to be human is to have trouble. We understand this. But we have survived. In some ways, many mangled and mazed, but we have survived, and in each generation, there are people, including those same children we're looking at, who are the people who will carry us into the next generation, intact and viable.
Now, there's one very famous African-American female who lived in Weeksville,
Yes.
the first African-American physician in the state of New York, possibly in the country, Dr. Susan Smith McKenney Stewart.
That's right.
Could you tell us a little about her and where she was?
Well, we love this woman madly because, first of all, she decided to come into the world and be born in Weeksville. We love her that. I think it was 1846 that she was born, and she died in 1917, I believe. She's now buried at Greenwood Cemetery, which is a famous landmark cemetery.
We have a picture here that comes from the Greenwood Directory that shows her tomb and the way it's displayed.
Yes.
And you can see that she was born in 1846 and died in 1918.
Oh, 1918. And if you turn the page, you'll see a picture of her.
There
she is.
She's really the first black woman physician
in New York State.
In New York State.
And the third in their country.
Now, where did she go to medical school? Where did she get her skill?
She went to school at I have to look at that, but I don't want to make a boo-boo over here. She went to the New York Medical College for Women.
Oh, right.
And she practiced in Brooklyn and Manhattan from 1870 to 1895. And among other things, she founded a women's hospital and dispensary for women and children. And I'm anxious to say that because it was tough for her to become a doctor. In those days,
particularly if she was the first.
Honey, listen, they didn't want white women to be doctors. Far less, here's this woman, here she comes, she's gonna, and she was good too, because everybody of all races came to her. But women and children especially, because women were so put upon that women, they're very, the standards of how can we say decorum were quite different then. And they felt wonderful going to a very exceptionally qualified woman.
And she practiced in Weeksville?
She practiced in Weeksville, and she had an office on DeKalb Avenue. She was truly a pioneer.
There's a medical society named after her,
yes,
which many of the African-American women and some men belong to.
Yes, which is part of the National Medical Association, which, because that was something when the American Medical Association wouldn't accept doctors.
Well, the NMA still does exist. Yes. The AMA, the American Medical Association, accepts black physicians, but because of the historic nature and the specific problems of African Americans' health, the National Medical Association does an outstanding job.
Outstanding. And I must mention Dr. Vernal Cave, who was a wonderful man, who was at one time the president of the National Medical Association, practiced in Brooklyn, and he's passed away now, but he's one of the treasures that we need to remember.
Yeah, Vernal Cave is an icon in Brooklyn,
an icon.
without a question. Now that you've done all of this, I understand you need to raise some money to
Yes.
do even more. Could you tell us
course.
about this benefit that you have coming forth and where it's going to be and who's involved in it?
Okay, well, I'm delighted you came to that. On this Monday, November 4th, 2002, the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant History will be having its second large gala at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And it's going to be very exciting. We have some fantastic, can I say who we're going to be honoring? We have some outstanding people who we're going to honor. I was fortunate enough to be honored last year. But I want to tell you that this year we're going to be honoring John A. Thane, the founder and co-chief operating officer of Goldman Sachs Group.
Yeah, that helps a lot.
That helps a lot.
John's a very fine man.
He is a fine, and you know he's a trustee at Howard University too. You may know that. And we'll be honoring Dr. Adelaide H. Sanford, Vice Chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents.
Who taught in Brooklyn and who was a principal in Brooklyn,
yes,
has been outstanding
at PS 70,
spokesman.
where my son went as a child. Last year we honored Mr. Charles Hammer. I got to say something about him. This is Independence Community Bank, a tremendous support for.
They've been a tremendous supporter.
Because they understand something about how a city and how area stays healthy and moves forward. You can't really do well if your arm is falling off, if your foot is falling off, and you're going to pretend your arm and leg is not hurting, you know. And we're going to be honoring Danny Simmons, who is an artist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, who is a great person and who's an artist and who has a beautiful studio in Brooklyn. And we're going to be honoring Florence Smith, who is an educator. Florence Smith was one of the earliest people to join society. Florence Smith taught English in high school. And she was a person who could see children who she knew they had this talent, and she was given that extra push. And she was a dear friend of somebody very dear to us, who was Joe Haynes. Joe Haynes was the black airplane pilot who put Jim Hurley in his plane, and they flew over the area, and that's how they found the historic houses. But Florence Smith was like a mother. And I should say more, Joe Haynes looked to her as a mother because her husband was an airplane pilot, and not too many black airplane pilots running around. So it was a very familiar kind of thing, and she loved Joe. She loved the fact that he was working like crazy for the Weeksville Society. She loved Jim Hurley, who is, he's about, no, I'm 1 week older than he is. Well, we were all getting old together. But all these people, we became a Weeksville family. It's a very funny thing. I shouldn't say, not funny in a ha-ha way, but funny in, I think, a very human way.
Now, I noticed that the invitation says past and forward.
Yes.
That's a very interesting concept. Now, what does that concept actually mean?
Well, if I can make so bold as to read the front of this thing here, it says past, it says education, history, endurance, preservation, community. And on the side, this is forward. This is research, education center, restoration, collaborative projects, multimedia resource center, workshops, performances, technology, museum, culture, visual arts.
That's quite a message.
You're telling me.
That's quite a message.
But you know, in this world we're living, it has always been complex, but I think it's right in our face right now.
Now, what about the public schools? I believe there's a school right in the Weeksville community.
Yes, and I'm very amiss that I didn't talk about them first at all, because we a little bunch of people, not any really professional people, but people with a great feeling that this needs to happen.
I have to say that you and your committee, and you're very professional, so you can go on past that. Now let's talk about the school. Okay,
we're talking about PS 243. Now called the Weeksville School. It started out in life, 1847, as Colored School Number 2 of Weeksville, when there was a segregated school system here in the city of New York. And there wasn't any place for the kids to go, people of African descent, and they formed a school. And it was called Colored School Number 2 of Weeksville. Colored School Number 1, it was like more in the Fort Greene area. And then when the schools were finally desegregated officially anyway, and the school was rolled over into the numerals of the public school system, it became PS 243. the Weeksville School, and it was also known as the Isaac Newton School. Then we came along and we found out the origins of the school name and actually found a photograph when it was still colored school number 2. And they had to, when I say we, it was the board of the Parents and Teachers Association had to petition the Board of Education. To
let me ask you, how much of the students who are now in that school know about the history and heritage of Weeksville?
One of the people who used to keep the history alive there was Dr. Margaret Thompson, who now teaches a master's course for teacher education at Brooklyn College, but she used to keep it alive a lot there. But right now, but what she did too, and this is so important, she developed something called the Weeksville Young Ambassadors Exchange Program, where she took kids from the Weeksville School and several other kids from around the United States, took them to London and Paris, took them to Barbados, took them to East Africa. I went to London and Paris with them at I guess 1983. But those kids now are grown up, and now they are showing interest and wanting to continue this with their children. Some of these kids have done very well.
Well, some of them, I hope, are going to be at this benefit.
We expect them to be there, and we want them, everyone they want to send, everybody to clap.
Okay, now again, would you remind our viewers about your benefit for the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant?
History. We're going to have this on November 4th, 2002. We have a fantastic new director. Her name is Pamela E. Green. She's taken on a tough job. She's bright and smart and courageous, and we love her madly. We have a strong and getting even stronger board of directors.
And if anyone wants to hear about this, how do they get in touch with you?
Oh, they can call the Weeksville Society in Brooklyn, and that is area code 718-623-0600. And they will give you all of it. And we'd love you to come and be with us, because this is the beginning of a fabulous thing. And you put the people who have put so much of themselves in it, we wanted to know that we pledge to make sure that their dream stays alive.
It's very clear that Joan Maynard has put a lot of herself into it. It's also very clear that folks like you and the people on the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville have done an outstanding job of preserving Black history.
It's the world's history.
It is the world's history.
This United States wouldn't happen except we were here.
Thank you very much, Joan Maynard, for being with us, and hope a lot of folks participate in this benefit for the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant History.